afternoon, and thank you for joining the webinar. I'm Paula Sullivan, the Senior Marketing Manager for the Central Area here at UiPath. And before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. All participants will be in a listen-only mode during the presentations. If you have a question, please add it to the Q&A box, and it will be answered either during the presentations or during the Q&A session after the presentation. The slides will be shared after the webinar along with a link to the live recording. At this point, I'd like to turn things over to Brian Barrett, Vice President of Business Transformation at Ashling Partners, to kick things off. Brian?
Thank you, Paula, and thank you everyone for joining our webinar today on defining and delivering value through intelligent automation. As we were thinking about different webinar topics and where we felt like we would like to discuss, we felt that this topic was one of the most critical and impactful to hyperautomation programs or intelligent automation programs. The overall success and longevity of an automation program, we feel, is predicated upon its ability to identify the right opportunities, track those opportunities, and then communicate across the entire program the value that's been realized by automating these processes. I think all of us can say that in certain situations, we've either underestimated or overestimated the value of the automation. We've underestimated the complexity of building that automation. Or back in 2014 to 2016, a lot of times we spoke about these automations as bots or processes as opposed to really talking about the value being derived from automating these solutions. I've got a number of wonderful people joining me today here on this webinar that I'd like to make you aware of. First is Jim Mahalik. He and I will be presenting here at the onset of this webinar. Jim Mahalik is a Senior Director for Value Engineering at UiPath. He's a Amazon #1 best-selling author on strategic IT topics. And prior to UiPath, Jim was twice a former CIO and former consulting partner. Myself, Brian Barrett, I'm an equity owner and vice president in the Business Process Transformation Group at Ashling Partners. My focus in this capacity has been on delivery execution, as well as the establishment of Center of Excellence programs and scaling automation programs. Prior to Ashling Partners, I worked at 2 leading advisory organizations as well. I think many of you joined to hear from our client panel, and we've got an excellent client panel for you today. First, we have Brandy Corbello from Cushman & Wakefield. Then we have James Wilson from Cormark and Sherry Benzelock from Apogee. I don't think I can do them justice with their introductions. And so instead, when we get to the client panel section, I'm going to let them talk about their experience and how they're leading their automation programs. Again, thank you for all of our client panel for being willing to participate in the webinar. We have a number of topics that we'd like to go through with you today. The first half of the webinar will be focused on the first 5 topics. And then the last half of the webinar will be focused on hearing our experiences from the client panel and recommendations from them. We'll start by talking about the state of automation. Then we'll go into what use cases are ideal for automating. We'll then transition into 4 UiPath technologies that we've seen that are fueling value capture. And then the last 2 areas of kind of recommendations and educational material we'll provide is around measuring value hacks and going enterprise-wide. Then we'll move over to probably the most impactful area that you've been looking forward to, which is hearing from our client panel and their experiences and recommendations. Jim, if it's all right, I'll turn it over to you to give an overview of automation.
Well, thanks, Brian. Go on to the next slide for him. You know, we're thinking about how things are being impacted with COVID and what's going on in the state of the world. And I think when we look at transforming our digital platforms, looking at our new IT strategy, Gartner and McKinsey are companies we look to for guidance. And you can see what McKinsey is saying here, that the old way of doing things is no longer going to work in our new normal. What used to be acceptable for 3- and 4-year projects now has to give way to things that are far more agile and being able to be done in weeks or days even. And if you look at Gartner's comments at the bottom there, it says that last year, their number one strategic technology trend that they surveyed from their population was that hyperautomation driven by RPA was the top of the list. And you can see also there that the second fastest category for job searches within LinkedIn has been the RPA developer category. Go on to the next slide, please, Brian. So when we think about our RPA automation, McKinsey did a great study, and they said that there are roughly 1.5 billion knowledge workers that are spending over 10 billion hours a year on repetitive, mundane tasks. And that equates to roughly, in their mind, $3.6 trillion in work product. In many cases, this work involves moving data between applications like Oracle and SAP, Microsoft Office, SharePoint, Salesforce. In lean manufacturing terms, these are not value-added activities. And since these repetitive tasks don't add value, we look for areas to replace those non-value-added tasks with robots. Adding to this, the growth in applications is making this even more challenging, with apps growing over 70% in the last 4 years. I mean, just think of your own work. How many tabs do you have open on your browser at any one time? Next page. The global pandemic has certainly accelerated the move to the fully automated enterprise. Digital transformation now is no longer a luxury, it's a state of business. Look at some of these results from a recent survey. Only 12% of the respondents believe that their IT department was capable of keeping up with the demand for digital. Employees reported that 48% of their time was spent lost to tedious processes. 93% of the C-level executives reported that RPA kickstarted their digital transformation. 83% of the respondents state that they'll use RPA to build agility, diversity, and resilience in their operations. Next slide. As we look to what Gartner is showing us here, it's pretty straightforward. RPA use is increasing right now at 30% rate for both, as you see there, customer and sales experiences. We're seeing a great reduction in cost as companies move these repetitive tasks to robotic automation. The automation scripts that people are writing, they're generating them at a high rate, increasing 50% by 2023. And we're seeing that RPA also is very, very helpful in helping drive value with complementary technology. So RPA, as I said, reaching across the Oracles and SAPs and Workdays of the world to collect the data, to collate the data, and in many cases to organize and package the data. Next slide. This was a particularly interesting study that came out of Capgemini. At the top, we see companies that have been leaders in adopting RPA. And at the bottom, we see those companies that report that they're still slow to get on the bandwagon. The companies that have been leaders in adopting RPA are showing 75% of them showing that RPA is helping them increase company revenue, compared to 37% of those who were followers. Same with profitability. 76% of the leaders are showing increased profitability that's been RPA enabled, 49% of the followers. Operating expenses are down, capital expenses are down, even business model innovation is being enabled by RPA across the companies that are leading in this transformation. Next slide. Brian, back to you.
Jim, you did a wonderful job talking about how impactful RPA has been and how organizations are really using this for digital transformation to drive their digital transformation. What we've seen in the marketplace, really, if we go back to 2016, is you probably heard a number of terms around automation, or you've seen changes within the marketplace and how automation is being applied. Back before 2016, what we saw was that organizations were very focused on just task automation, automating tasks where people were tired of doing those manual and redundant activities. But there wasn't a true focus on potentially these end-to-end automations or the true value that could be derived from automating more of an end-to-end process. In 2017 and 2018, RPA has continued to grow, focused on more of these process automations. And you've likely heard intelligent automation, and now the new terminology that we've heard out in the marketplace is around hyperautomation. We're focusing on whole business functions and functional areas and using automation to help really drive and achieve business outcomes. The focus, as I'd recommend, is how you're able to automate end-to-end processes and really drive value from your program by automating these processes and avoiding those things that are just task automations that were a focus several years ago. The next area that we wanted to share with you are just some recommendations on what you should automate, either those use cases or the benefits that you should be looking at. If I move over into what makes a good candidate for intelligent automation, there's 5 things that we typically recommend that you should look at. First, where are those manual and repetitive data entry areas or processes? Unlike other automation technologies in the past that were leveraged, like VB scripts or server-based scripts, RPA in tandem with other capabilities are able to go across multiple platforms and technologies or applications. So no longer do you need to store information or pass information to the script. It's able to do this from end to end, and so that's no longer a concern. Also, the areas where there's high volumes or where you need to perform a lot of quality control and validations between systems or validations before performing the process are very good opportunities for automation. Lastly, those processes that are business rule driven, that can be defined step by step, are typically the best candidates for automation because it will do those steps just as they're defined and nothing more, nothing less. When automating the right use cases, what we've noticed is that organizations experience 5 benefits by automating these. The first is that by using RPA and the other automation capabilities in tandem with that, organizations are able to experience significant productivity gains. The robots are able to work 24/7, and in addition, they work faster than a human would. Because of this, it results in significant cost savings as well as improving the productivity of the teams. We found through various sources that a robot typically costs about the third of an offshore resource. And so there typically are significant cost savings as a result of automating these processes. Also, as far as benefits, risk management as far as performing these quality controls and reducing risk through 100% validation, as opposed to only checking maybe 5 to 10% because it was manual beforehand, has really helped increase the ability to catch errors and reduce risk. We've also seen that a number of organizations have been able to use this innovation to be able to increase their ability to hire new workers, as well as be able to use this innovation to increase flexibility, as well as scale teams. Lastly, almost 95% of employees would prefer to work on more value-added activities as opposed to these manual and mundane activities. And so what we've seen is increased employee satisfaction and increased drive to add value into their organizations because they're able to focus on these value-added activities. As you may be thinking, across an organization, because this technology of RPA is so flexible, it's able to automate use cases across the enterprise, whether it's within internal audit, finance and accounting, or all the way to supply chain. There's a number of opportunities just depending on where those manual and redundant activities are done. And these are just some of the many use cases where we've seen value or seen organizations want to focus on automating these areas. As one of the major activities of an automation program, it's identifying the right candidates. We talked about the right use cases and what are typically the considerations of the ideal use case, as well as the benefits that can be achieved. But in addition to that, there's 4 areas where I found that organizations can really help identify opportunities and prioritize those. The first is by looking at corporate or business unit objectives, whether those are DSO or DPO metrics, or if there are specific metrics on increasing efficiency. a lot of times looking at these corporate or business unit objectives and applying automation to help achieve those is a good opportunity. Also looking at industry or department measures. At Ashling Partners, we use APQC with specific metrics based on the size of an organization or their revenue to look at cost per invoice and see where you're currently at and how to improve that by leveraging automation. Another example is looking at your total uncollected balance as a percent of revenue, seeing where you are and how we can use automation to really achieve those measures. The last two that I wanted to call out to everyone is looking at more of a top level executive, where they've got specific business unit or department objectives, or where they're visualizing where FTEs are allocated and helping achieve goals through automation. And lastly, the right use cases can come from those process owners. They're the ones that understand these processes inside and out, understand where there's a lot of manual and redundant effort, where there could be process improvement or risk reduction and quality control by validating 100% of the data. And lastly, where they could use automation to really increase consistency. So across an organization, there are a number of ways, these 4 ways I recommended, to help identify these right use cases and be able to prioritize the right ones. As these ideas have come in addition to RPA, a number of technologies are helping really augment teams or automate processes from end to end. So just a couple examples here are optical character recognition. For AP invoice entry, for example, we have to retrieve those invoices, extract the information, and then it moves into these additional 4 steps of standardizing the data, making sure that you have all the right data and determining what steps are next for the automation, and then executing those processes. A lot of times we need a human involved in tandem with the automation. And that's what we're trying to display here is a lot of times we'll have the process run as far as possible. And then when we come up upon an exception or where a human needs to be involved, the robot is able to pass that over to the person to finish it up. But I think the last thing that the process owners and the executives need is a good, easy way to view the value and view what the automation has done. And so what we always recommend for our clients is that there needs to be a good way to display what the human needs to do and also the value that's been achieved through these automations. Jim, if it's all right, I'll pass it back over to you to talk about the 4 UiPath technologies that we've seen that are fueling scale.
Thanks, Brian. You can go on to the next slide. So these are the 4 we're going to talk about today. We have a complete platform of opportunities to discuss, but I want to focus on these 4 today: task mining, automation hub, process mining, and task capture. If you go to the next slide, we'll talk about automation hub. Automation hub is really a central place. Well, it's a hub, of course, where a lot of our activity is done. And it says there to help you accelerate delivery and build strong business cases. But really, if you go to the next slide, it really unpacks some of the richness that's in the automation hub. Part of the thing when you're starting an RPA journey is to say, well, where am I going to find opportunities? And when I begin to identify them, how do I manage my pipeline? A lot of people used to manage their pipeline with Excel or do things in SharePoint, and that's fine as you've got 3 or 4 items in the pipeline. But when you begin to get dozens or even hundreds, it's really helpful to have that pipeline management done in a much more efficient way. And so there's a pipeline management function within the automation hub. Part of managing the pipeline is saying, well, which opportunities that are in the pipeline present the greatest return for us to do. Not every automation is as rewarding as others. And so we have an ROI calculator that walks through of the ones that are in the pipeline, helps you understand what could be the potential return for developing some of those. Obviously, as you're building your robots and you're doing these things and you're building a variety of documents, your PDDs and your XAMLs and so forth, you've got to have a place to put all that information. So there's a documentation repository. One thing that's great about UiPath's capabilities are, as you begin to build various activities, you'll build components. For example, if one of the things that you do routinely is sign into SAP, then when you build the sign into SAP capability, you can save that component. So every future robot that needs to sign into SAP doesn't have to recreate that particular piece of code, but rather can just pull that in from the component library. And then you can see what's going on across the enterprise. And as it says there in option 6, the performance dashboards to show you what you're doing. Now, if you go on to the next page, how we capture this information and how we find out where are the automation opportunities. We've got a variety of tools to help you, starting with task capture. It allows you, as it says there, to document, enhance, and implement what you're doing. On the next page, it walks us through a little more detail. We've got a process capture capability that allows you to capture what the process does itself, allows you to build kind of a diagram or a flow chart, if you will. The ability to edit this, and a lot of our code is no code or drag and drop with various components. And then you, as it builds the document, you can export your PDDs and your XAMLs out to the organization. Beyond task capture, the next slide, if you would, we're looking at process mining. This is a really rich tool set. That you set process mining in place, and it goes through and it begins to watch and see what the system does. We've got 2 basic capabilities to capture information. We're going to mine what the system does, and we're going to mine what the individual people do. This is mining what the system does. So as you begin to track how invoices flow through the system, how they're received, how they're approved, how they're paid, and so forth, process mining can go through all those various steps. And what you might have thought were just a 6 or 7 step process, as process mining begins to go through this over and over again, it may report back that because of certain exceptions, it could be as many as 15 steps for your organization. And it lays all this out for you so that as we begin to build the robots, we understand exactly where the processes are and what exceptions need to be put in place. And as you can see, a lot of this is done with a great visual tool set. Next page. So it helps you, like it says, gather the data to understand it, and then optimize it using the insights you've gained. And one thing we recommend with process mining is, let's say you are able to automate a particular process, say invoice capture. Once you do process mining and you put the robots in place, rerun the process mining again, because once you fine-tune a particular area, you may find that there's even ways to fine-tune on top of that. And so process mining, as we recommend it, is not just a one-time activity, but it can be an ongoing activity as you continue to seek ways to streamline using our tools. Going to the next page. Now then, task mining allows me to capture and gather what the individual people are doing. And so it allows me to follow the clicks and navigational tasks that I do going through my job. So this will be something that I may run for myself. And as it finds out and learns what it is I do, it can then build a robot for me to do those various things. And this may not be a process that works across the organization. This may be just a robot that helps me and 2 or 3 of my colleagues with a particularly tedious task that we do on a repetitive basis. And so by deploying task mining out to the population, then I could have those people capture what they do in task mining, and then it could help build the robots from there. And then again, putting things back through Automation Hub allows me to understand what the ROI of each of these various robots might be going forward. Next page. And this is what I was basically saying. It shows me various navigations, how I open the invoice, I go into Workday to do some details, maybe into SAP to pay the invoice and so forth. And so as it follows my points and clicks and navigation, it's then recording all that so then it can export it out and create and begin to build the robot process. Next. And as Brian talked about some of the value drivers, we're seeing the same things. People want to use RPA to do basically 4 things: either help them accelerate growth and enable operational efficiency, where they're using robots in a customer-facing sense to help with improving the customer experience. We're seeing a lot of great success in call centers using robots to help reduce average handle time, improve first call resolution. As we help move some of these routine, tedious, and mundane tasks off of employees' plates and put them in robots, it frees the employees up to do the kinds of jobs they were hired to do, analysis and more review and so forth. That hopefully is going to improve the employee experience and happiness. And once we put all this in place, we're going to have, as Brian was showing earlier, operational resiliency and risk mitigation. Robots don't break down, they don't quit, they don't take breaks, they don't go on vacation. And so once it's in place, we're able to maintain a repeatable and compliant operation. Next slide. And so are value hacks. We really have 4 things we look for. If you think about when you go to present to your executives, hey, we want to spend a certain amount of money to do this new initiative, they're going to ask, well, what's in it for the business? And usually the answer is one of these 4 things. Does it help us increase sales? Does it help us reduce expenses? Help us optimize assets or mitigate risks? And here we have 4 examples. We've done this for many, many companies. We've helped companies use robots to create new revenue streams, to cut operational costs. We've helped several companies use our robots to help them with their supply chain and manage their manufacturing processes. And we've got a number of banks and insurance companies that are using robots to help them identify and mitigate fraud and risk. On the next page, beyond just the financial stuff though, it's always important to understand what's the value of returning this time back to the organization. We euphemistically joke here at UiPath that we've created a time machine, because all these hours that we pour back into the business, what can people do with them? Now, here are some good call center examples. And the third one down there is one of my favorites we talk about. The more we can add time back to the sales force, one would think those salespeople could then make more sales calls. And every company has a metric that says every number of sales calls yields an order. So whether it's 5 sales calls to get an order or whether it's 15, the more sales calls we can enable salespeople to do because we free up time, then they can make more sales calls, hopefully make more orders. But also the value of automation beyond just financial stuff is on that right-hand column where it's auditable, it's secure, it's compliant. It's a great way for your organization to really button down many of these tedious tasks so it reduces the potential for human error. Next slide. Ryan, back to you.
Thank you, Jim. A lot of times when we try to quantify the value of a process to be automated, as well as post-automation, a lot of times what we do is we look at these 3 E's of value. First, the efficiency or doing things right, the effectiveness of doing the right things, and lastly, the experience by taking the efficiency of doing things right, the effectiveness of doing the right things, and that leads to the entire experience. That leads to customer adoption, and that also oftentimes leads towards internal adoption as well. You can see here within efficiency, effectiveness, and experience that we've got a number of leading and lagging indicators. I won't go through all these measures with you, but this is as we've experienced and communicated the value that the automation will bring or what the automation is bringing, we focused on these 3 E's of value. Jim spoke about those 4 UiPath platform technologies that are bringing value. And I wanted to just highlight 2 that I think are critical as we've communicated these 3 E's of value. The first is as we're trying to identify and prioritize those processes, Automation Hub comes in to help really capture those ideas and then quantify the value that would come out of the automation. Within Automation Hub, it's within this cost benefit analysis. You can help identify how much of the process can be automated, what that automation potential is as far as ease of implementation, as well as looking at the manual effort and then the value of automation by looking at those net benefits. I think this has helped organizations really take in and get those automation ideas and then really prioritize the right ones. The other platform capability that I wanted to let you all know of is UiPath Insights. UiPath Insights has really helped, after that automation is in production, gather the key details on the automation. Now, normally what this will help give is very clear insight from both the process owners as well as at an aggregate level per process, what has been performed. A lot of times we'll have to take this information and then transform it to really show some of the key high-level metrics. If you're trying to calculate, for example, impact on cash flow, or some of these other metrics that you can't get by an individual level, it stores all that information so it's much easier to calculate and quantify and communicate. And so this is the piece that I think really adds to being able to monitor the long-term benefit of the automation and the value that you're deriving on a long-term basis. The next area that we wanted to give a little bit of insight into is how to go enterprise-wide. At Ashling Partners, what we have is our Center of Excellence. You may have heard of the AOM model from UiPath. It's very similar. What we focus on, what we consider are the core pillars and key aspects of an automation program are these 8 pillars here listed. We typically look at and start with what is the strategy and vision of the program? Then what operating model and team and talent do we need to be able to support the program? How do we make sure from an internal and an external perspective that we ensure that we think about and perform change management so that there is adoption and so that it is supporting both internally and externally those that are affected by the automation? Looking at process identification and measurement, like we spoke about with Automation Hub, identifying the right processes, measuring the value, and estimating that properly. And then moving into the development and management of those automations. The last 2 pillars that are critical that we look at with our Center of Excellence is making sure that you have the right infrastructure and architecture in place to be able to support these automations, as well as the licensing needed to be able to have the number of robots that you need for these automations. And lastly, the innovation pillar. A lot of these processes, as they're identified, there may be additional technologies and platform capabilities, such as document understanding, that need to be applied. And so having that visibility into those processes and those capabilities to be able to address them. The model that we've seen or the journey that we've seen is first starting with establishing this foundation, the key strategy and governance that you need for your program in each one of these pillars. Then executing on that foundation, and also many organizations either want to expand amongst other business units or departments, or that global expansion. Lastly, in phase 3, what we typically address in these core pillars is really driving that global scale and making it a frictionless experience. So that if you have a group in the United States, for example, that's delivering automation capabilities, and another group in Europe, that it's frictionless across both. With these 8 pillars, what we typically see is that we're able to overcome some of the common difficulties that organizations communicate. This is, how do I create greater interest and support with the program? How do I continue the momentum that I initially drove with the initial automations? And then how do I continue to scale? Lastly, on the scale and business outcome, I wanted to give a little bit of perspective on how we've seen organizations really create and scale their programs. First, the first recommendation that I have is to think and go high. Think about your program with a bigger vision, the art of the possible, and what you truly can achieve. Then go deep. Go deeper into those business units, go deeper into those departments, and really focus on where there are truly opportunities, where there's a lot of manual and redundant effort or a lot of FTEs that need to be applied to perform those processes. Next is going wide. So a lot of times we'll automate a part of a process where there's the biggest pain point or the biggest manual effort. But automating that end-to-end process can really alleviate the teams and reduce a lot of that manual effort that occurs. And then lastly, going long. So creating a multi-year roadmap, creating that long-term vision will help you be able to scale, communicate what you're trying to achieve, and make sure that you've got the right support to be able to do that. Before we move over into the client panel, what we wanted to see is if there are any questions or comments in the chat that we should address. Marshall, have you seen anything come through?
Not yet, Brian. I think we should hop into the panel here.
Perfect. Thank you, Marshall. As I mentioned, we've got a wonderful panel here joining us today. Brandy, do you mind introducing yourself and your experience and what you're doing at Cushman & Wakefield?
Sure, I'll go pretty brief. Brandy Corbell, I'm a VP of Transformation at Cushman & Wakefield, really leading transformation efforts across the organization, and within that, having a hyperautomation technology stack.
Thank you, Brandy. James, do you mind introducing yourself?
Certainly. James Wilson from Cormark. I'm the Director of Corporate Accounting and lead our RPA initiative here. We've been on the journey for a little while. And still maturing, but we've had some really good success in the finance and accounting as we centralize a lot of our activities. We look to automate them as well. So excited to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Sherry, do you mind if I pass it over to you real quick?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. And I'm Sherry Benzalak. I am the VP of Finance for Apogee Enterprises. And in our Apogee journey, we are at the very, very beginning of our automation and digital transformation. But in my previous roles, we have also essentially deployed automation solutions. And I spent most of my career at Honeywell. And I think we started with automation back in, I think it was 2014-15 timeframe. So I've seen the ability to deploy over time and to see how that really impacts your business. So hopefully I can answer questions from a variety of different perspectives.
Thank you, Sherry. What we did is we came up with a number of questions that came from a survey that we put out towards the end of 2020. It was a 2021 automation survey, as well as some of the main comments or things that we've had to overcome as part of the Center of Excellences that organizations have established. So what we did is we put together a list of questions for the panelists, and then assigned panelists just based on your experiences and where you felt like you could contribute the most. And so we've got a number of questions that we put together and would love to hear, feedback from our client panelists today. So the first question that we received or have is, why is capturing value of the automations important to your automation program? Brandy, do you mind sharing your thoughts on this first?
Sure. Yeah. Automation requires investment from the business, and really from a leadership perspective, regardless of what the investment is, you should be sure that it brings value to the business. Otherwise, really, why bring the investment?
James, could you contribute any thoughts as well?
Certainly. And I second that. It's, to be real brief, it's to fund the program. It really sells the program, and make sure that other people are aware of what we are able to do. And it's also been kind of another way to get other business partners and excited for the automations as well. As they hear about successes in finance, many other departments have started reaching out to see what they could do in terms of automation. So it becomes pretty important to share that value with the executive group.
Thank you, James. Sherry, do you mind sharing some of your thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I think I agree 100% with Brandy and James. One thing is, when you start out with your automation journey, you're likely going to need to add more capabilities. And if you've been successful in essentially sharing the value of what you've achieved so far, you are more likely to get additional funding for your programs and to be able to really scale them across the organization. And, I think what I find is that people are generally skeptics, especially when you're first starting out in an automation program. They're not really sure what it means to have a digital bot do portions of your work. And I think as you help explain that value and really try to help others in the organization understand that value, they'll become less and less skeptical. And to the extent that you can share those use cases, I find that people are typically a lot more open to trying them and not quite as skeptical. And I think when I've seen this done really, really well, what'll happen is you'll get kind of a groundswell. If people can see the value and they can see what you can deliver to the organization, they're going to want to participate. They don't want to be left behind. So people will then start to come to the transformation teams to really be able to, provide more and more demand for the transformation teams. And then once you have that groundswell, you're golden. You can really do a lot with that support that is in your organization. So the value communication is essential. in my view, in making this really successful.
Thank you, Sherry. I'll move over to the next question. And James and Sherry, if you want to respond to this, do you view and monitor the value of your automations at an aggregate level, or are you solely doing it by individual process?
Yeah, good question. So to be honest, it's a little bit of both. We're probably not as far as some organizations, but we have about 40 automations that we're running, but not all automations are equal. Some are much larger and transformative than others. Some I like to bucket and call them more kind of quality of life automations, something to excite a business partner or make them happy, make them engaged. That does have savings, low investment, low savings. And so we do have a handful of those. So we kind of have bucketed it that way. The transformational ones that are really funding our program, we monitor and measure those at the individual level. But for the kind of the quality of life and the nice to have automations, those are just kind of separately bucketed, and we kind of monitor them and do a high level estimate, just showing that those are adding value as well.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, I would add, think about what's in it for me is kind of the way that I think about this. And to the extent that you have different stakeholders, they're going to want to know what's in it for them. And that will require you to think about the value of your program and the communication of the value in different ways. So if you think about the senior executives, the CIO and the CFO, those types of roles, they're going to want to understand the value of the program. But if you're in a function, you're definitely going to want to understand the value of the function. And if you're specifically owning a process, you're likely going to be interested in understanding the value of the process. So I think it's really all of the above, right? And it really just depends on who your stakeholders are and what they expect of you.
Thank you, James and Sherry. Sherry, I got the next question just for you. So what approaches or platform capabilities are you using or plan to use to capture the value of automations, both kind of pre and post implementation?
Yeah, I think I love process mining. I think that is one of the most incredible tools that I've seen in the hyperautomation space. And I think that really helps look at the entire program and understand where you can impact the program. So we plan to use that at Apogee, and we are using RPA. So we're just in the process of building our first bots. And to me, the two of those things together really add value because you're able to understand and measure your process, and you're able to, impact your process essentially, and understand how you've impacted it. So I love those two things together. And I get really excited when I see the process mining. So I feel like there's just so much information that you can understand about what is happening in the business when you see those process mining maps and how they're impacting your metrics.
Thank you. Next question we have is, how do you communicate the value of the automation program that it's bringing to your organization? Sherry, do you mind continuing again?
Yeah. No, we have an executive steering committee. So we have a report out, and that consists of our CIO and our CFO, and a number of other senior leaders, a couple of presidents. And we typically give them an update as to where we're at, what kind of challenges we're having, and help them understand where we're at. Since we're at the beginning of the program, we haven't talked a lot about value except for the hypothesis that we have around the value. But we will essentially start to evolve. I think as we mature the program, the questions that the leadership team will have will evolve. And so that is our main mechanism for communication. But I think also after we get, through our first automations, we plan to share those results and, what those automations were with the other segments. So we started in one segment. And as I said earlier, I think it's really important to share those things, even if it's in a different function, just so that people can start to digest what automation means. And that will likely be done through our SharePoint site or our homepage or intranet.
Thank you. Brandy, do you have any thoughts you can contribute as well?
Sure. So our team is set up by kind of assigned business partnerships throughout the organization. We started with kind of parallel programs on day one. So they're aligned to business partnerships. So they meet with their business unit leaders monthly, and we're starting to get into more of a consistent governance with leaders to ensure the value that we think, the automation program has created, they agree with and they've realized. But beyond that, we're starting to send out infographics on a quarterly basis to our executive team, just to show them, spotlights of what's going on and how the whole program consolidated looks.
Thank you. Sherry and James, the next question I have for you, overall, in your experience, what has gone well and what has not gone so well when predicting the value or tracking the value of automations? I think this is difficult for any program, and just hearing your experience may lend a hand to those attending.
Yeah, I mean, in any program, you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. Just move on quickly. But I think it's hard when you first get started to articulate the value of what you think you're going to deliver, because when you're working with whoever owns that process, they I think are caught off guard when you ask them, how many hours do you think this takes, or how much time do you think this really impacts your team for the specific part of the process. It's hard for them to articulate, and it's even hard for them to articulate, variations within their processes. So getting started is a bit bumpy, and, just try to adjust your estimations as you go through. And then also, I think, communicating to your project sponsors at the beginning of the project why it's difficult to estimate is also a helpful thing to do. And I think, because the concept of automation is really new to a lot of people, they may have a sense that, oh, everything is going to be automated, and my jobs are going to go away, and you can stir up a number of I'm going to say incorrect hypotheses. So I would just communicate well with the people that you're working with in terms of helping them identify value for them. Again, it's like, what's in it for me, so that they can, participate more effectively in the program and really help get excited about it. And I think that will really help them engage, and then for you to get better information from them, because they'll be feeling like they're part of the project program, instead of feeling like maybe they're going to get their jobs are threatened or things like that. Because it can be scary.
Thank you, Sherry.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very good point. I would say for us, in terms of, so we've been at this since kind of the end of 2018. So we've gone through a couple different iterations of how we report out our value. I would say some of the key learnings of what did not go well was we had a fairly sizable project where the business partner, who's more or less owns a lot of stake in terms of the savings and what the benefit of the automation is, maybe I don't want to use the word fluffed, but kind of exaggerated the benefits of the automation, right? So once we got into testing, it became apparent, and then even we still went live with it, the automation wasn't very successful. So after investing a bit of time, we had kind of learned our lesson in, really being a gatekeeper on that business case up front when you're vetting it out, and not there's kind of a balance between wanting to be excited and getting new business partners, wanting to automate things, but still does it make business sense to invest the resources? So, that was kind of a learning curve. I mean, we had usually done that, but we did have a miss, and we kind of had to learn from that and go, get a little bit more strict in the future vetting of the business case and the initial ROI. And not just get so excited to just automate everything, right? On top of that, there's also what I would consider kind of the cost of optimizing things after go live that is very difficult to estimate, right? So a lot of times it was our experience as we were automating, we were also kind of re-engineering processes. My organization has been in a phase of standardizing and centralizing and automating, and it's kind of all hand in hand. And so through that process, there are certainly learnings after you get to production that, okay, had we fully known this business requirement, we would have done things differently. But now we're at a point where that's a significant lift to change. And it kind of gets back into the pipeline of building a business case on optimizing, which can really kind of frustrate some of the business partners. And so, one of the learnings is build a lot of hedge when it's a big transformational process, especially if it's got a lot of process redesign. Say, the go live period is going to take a lot longer because you're going to learn and you're going to want to keep your developer resources dedicated to that to be able to make some of those optimizations quickly. And that way you don't lose kind of the excitement and interest from the business case. I would say, we're not doing process mining, but Jim, you mentioned in your slides that kind of doing the process mining before and after automation. I really heard that, and I thought that was a really interesting idea. I thought that really made sense. And I could totally see the value in doing that, especially with that optimization frame on the automations. So overall, I think those were kind of the biggest challenge in kind of communicating the value of the automations. And it's lessons learned and something everybody goes through as they embark on this journey, I think.
Thank you, James and Sherry. I think both of you shared great experiences and things you've found on your journey. Brandy, this next question I have for you. What recommendations do you have for organizations that feel they're not identifying or capturing or communicating the value derived from their automations?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and we get asked this a lot. I think a lot of times if organizations have felt like they haven't identified the right value for what automation can do, they haven't really talked to the business leaders to ask them what their business problems are, right? To understand like what are the problems you're facing as a business unit leader. So that way you can really start diving in from a top-down perspective to understand what will really help the business rather than what will help individuals inside of that business. Because a lot of times we've taken this bottoms-up approach with automation, and really it's very individualized in how it helps people. So I think from an identification standpoint, it's really working with the leaders to understand what their problems are and how automation can fit into solving those. As far as capturing and communicating, our COE doesn't take on responsibility for the value, right? Instead, our responsibility is to report out on like what automation has done successfully and what it hasn't done successfully. Our job is then to partner with the business to say, are you realizing the value that we anticipated with this automation, like within your P&L or within the business problem we thought we were solving? And if yes, great, then that's the communication that goes out beyond that partnership. But if no, then what do we need to do to correct? So I think, it's really like working with the business on what creates value, and if we're not doing it right, a lot of times we're in the middle of it right now with one of our business partnerships. We're actually taking a step back and we're reevaluating from a top down and a bottoms up perspective to figure out where we should go next. So I think that's really the recommendation I would have.
Thank you. I think that was excellent feedback. Thank you, Brandy. Next question I have for you as well. How have you found success in expanding beyond those initial BUs and departments?
Yeah, it's interesting. Our program really didn't start like in finance or within one group. It started really strategically in parallel across back office, mid office, and client facing service lines. So really for us, it's more about continuing success and showing success as we move throughout the organization. And we just wrapped up year one of true stand up of the COE, and we're going into year two, and we're seeing a lot of momentum. But really, even now, the organization knows who we are and they know what we do, but we continue to really educate them on what automation is, what it isn't, what it can do for the business, and then really continue to articulate the value and read back the value that we are interpreting from automation. But now we're kind of heading into this other path of, automation is a component of your workforce, right? And as a business, we have to start thinking about what your talent transformation looks like, because automation is now your tactical layer or the foundational layer of the business. So that's kind of where we're heading now, which still continues to allow the automation conversation, but it's pushing a true business transformation conversation.
Thank you. Sherry and Brandy, I've got this question for you. So how have you found success in performing process identification and prioritization?
I'll start. And I mentioned earlier that I'm a huge fan of process mining, and I will give you some examples why. In my previous role, we deployed process mining on one system's order to cash process and a procure to pay process. And what we were trying to understand was, on the order to cash side, we had significant delivery issues. And so one of the things that we were looking to do was to understand what was happening with that process. And the supply chain teams had been spending months on, whiteboarding what they thought the processes were and how they thought they could impact the process. And when we put the data from our ERP into the process mining, we found that the biggest deterrent of process velocity and having a really smooth process was in the credit department. So it was shocking to the supply chain team that they actually were looking in the wrong spots. So it was the credit holds and that particular process that was really holding up things. And it was silly things that we found, like we were putting credit holds on orders that were, hundreds or even $20. And that was far from our strategic intent. And we had distribution partners who were very financially stable, and we were putting products on hold for our main distributor partners, which seemed also very, silly. So we were able to take that information and immediately impact that process. And that's just, one of the really exciting things that we found when we looked at the process. And it just really helps you get clarity on what the big things are that you're trying to work on. In the case of the procure to pay, we had our procure to pay team, was spending a lot of time on invoice entry, and they just couldn't get caught up, and we were paying late and, not sure if we were taking discounts. And when we put that data into the process mining tool, it just really enlightened us on what was actually really happening. And, we had then also some visibility around what our vendors were doing and how they were performing. And that was also really, really insightful information. And that information had been very difficult to find within our systems. And so it provided a lot of new information to the teams that were super, super excited about it. And then in addition to that, we were also able to see that we had a flaw in our process where we could essentially issue purchase orders after we had paid for the invoices, which is not compliant from a finance perspective. And so we understood where that leak was coming from and we were able to address it. So just a lot of information came from just exploring that process information. It was just incredibly insightful. And we also found data problems. So we actually found some of our materials didn't have a commodity code. And so they weren't showing up in some of our reports because there was no commodity code. So we found out that our reporting had been understated from our commodity purchases. So that was also another interesting finding. So the things that this isn't just about automation, it's helping us really understand what's happening. Do we have good data or bad data? Are we compliant? Are we non-compliant? So there was just a wealth of information that came out of the process mining exercise. So that's why I get really, really excited about it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience and how process mining has really helped you gain visibility into your processes and where you have opportunities. Brandy, can we end with you on the questions, just with this question?
Sure, yeah, and then I actually have to drop. So for us, process identification and prioritization, really, as I mentioned, we took a top-down approach we took a strategic lens going into the full program. So really understanding what are the business problems and starting to understand the processes that support the business that would support the problems that they're having to understand where do we want to go. And that's how we prioritize are really the big processes that support the business or the revenue generating teams. I think from there, really, as I mentioned, our team is now lined up to business partnerships. So they're fully ingrained into the business. So they're starting to understand, the problems and that the business is facing or the process issues and identifying those more often than not, since they do have those ingrained business partnerships. We've done process mining. It's a nice to have, right? It tells you what's going on in the system, but really until you get into what's really happening outside of even the system, it's tough to really point to from a process mining perspective.
Thank you, Brandy. Well, given that we're at time on the webinar, I'd like to just thank everyone for attending today. Thank you for joining, and we hope that we've given you a lot more insight into how James, Brandy, and Sherry have been able to define and deliver value through intelligent automation in their own experiences. And it's also these recommendations that Jim and I were able to provide today. Thank you again, and take care, everyone.